Welcome to this week's Movie Math, where someone must have set phasers to stun, as that was the mindset of both Paramount and Star Trek Into Darkness fans, as J.J. Abrams' sequel failed to engage warp drive. There were some needlessly vicious attacks against my own lukewarm review of the film, in step, by the way, with negative reviews from the New York Times, the Hollywood Reporter, the Chicago Sun-Times, and more, but it was proven once again that internet hype doesn't necessarily convert into box office dollars. While Hollywood had expected Star Trek Into Darkness to pull in $100 million, it actually ended up pulling in about $20 million less. Confusing matters was the Thursday start date, but either way, the flick couldn't match the 3 or 4 day totals of 2009 Star Trek. That's got to be leaving Paramount, Abrams, and the core fan base scratching their heads, as Star Trek Into Darkness had inflation and 3D surcharges working in its favor. But who exactly is the fan base for this new action-driven Star Trek? Original Trekkies have made no secret about disliking Abrams' alternative universe, which seems to have instead been co-opted by anti-Marvel DC fans. And indeed, there is a nasty anti-Iron Man 3 streak running deep within the internet, largely due to the twist, but that backlash certainly isn't reflected in the box office. Iron Man 3 has now joined the $1 billion club, passing by The Dark Knight just 3 weeks into its run. With this kind of a momentum, it's likely Iron Man 3 will make it into the top 10 grossing films of all time by the end of its run. Speaking of the top grossing films of all time, 2009 Star Trek didn't even make it into the top 100. A film needs to pull in over $530 million worldwide to make that cut, and 2009 Star Trek only grossed $385 million. I know that many of you would counter-argue that box office performance doesn't determine the quality of a film, but it does determine the future of a film franchise, as well as the careers of those involved. How do Disney and Kathleen Kennedy feel when they see this lackluster debut for Star Trek Into Darkness, knowing their new Star Wars trilogy will be helmed by the same guy? And maybe Paramount isn't feeling quite so bad that Abrams might not be available to helm the next Star Trek. There will be another Star Trek, by the way, as Paramount can't afford to lose another franchise after losing Marvel to Disney and DreamWorks Animation to Fox. Also, this isn't exactly the stellar Hollywood debut Benedict Cumberbatch and his fans were hoping for. Paramount chose to make the UK actor the focus of their advertising campaign, and so to some degree the success of the film falls on his shoulders. To many Americans, this was their first introduction to BBC's Sherlock, but he'll get to make a second impression as he has 3 other movies hitting theaters this year, as well as voice work in The Hobbit: The Desolation of Smaug. Finally, while it's nice to be vindicated after weathering some brutal responses to my Star Trek Into Darkness review, it's never fun to deliver bad news to hardcore fans, even when they didn't show the same consideration towards me. So if you're in need of a silver lining right about now, just remember that 87% of the reviews for Star Trek Into Darkness have been positive, and the flick is performing much better overseas. So far, it's taken in about $75 million, although over the weekend itself, it tied with Iron Man 3 for second place in the foreign market behind Gatsby. But Paramount is hoping that once again, the foreign box office will come to the rescue. As for the rest of the weekend box office, Star Trek Into Darkness did manage to inflict some damage on its competition. Iron Man 3 fell another 50% as it continues to stay a step behind the Avengers box office performance from last year. Still, as I mentioned earlier, it has powered past the $1 billion mark. Another movie that seems to be weathering a harsh backlash is Baz Luhrmann's The Great Gatsby, as the flick held up better than similar stylish chick flick Sex and the City. That pick dropped about 60% in its second weekend, while Gatsby has fallen about 50%. Gatsby is set to pass the $100 million mark sometime this week. As you can see from these numbers, though, audiences are less and less interested in smaller flicks, instead saving their money for theater-worthy experiences. This was the focus of a New York Times article last week, pointing out that as the studios try to lure audiences into the theater as opposed to waiting to watch at home, that has resulted in the loudest and most crowded summer slate of movies ever. Yes, the release schedule is so tight that each blockbuster basically has just one weekend to make it or break it. Many of you are already hoping that Star Trek Into Darkness might be saved stateside by strong word of mouth. But can it compete with Fast and Furious 6 and The Hangover Part 3 this coming weekend, quickly followed by After Earth, The Purge, Man of Steel, This Is the End, World War Z, and on and on and on? The article relates an interesting anecdote from Steven Soderbergh, who at the San Francisco International Film Festival admitted to spying on a fellow flyer at Kennedy Airport. Seeing a white guy in his 30s pull out his iPad, Soderbergh wanted to know what this key demographic had downloaded. Turns out it was several special effects blockbusters, and the man was fast-forwarding through all the story and dialogue to just watch the big action sequences. That's obviously an extreme case, but still sheds light on the evolving interests of a digitally entranced short attention span audience. Speaking of that tight movie release schedule, Fast and Furious 6 is set to dominate this coming Memorial Day weekend, with The Hangover Part 3 and Epic are expected to pull in some respectable coin as well. And if you're going to be in Phoenix this holiday weekend, I hope you'll stop by Phoenix Comic-Con, where I'm honored to be a guest. I'll be at the Boom Studios booth on Saturday and Sunday. And that's the weekend box office. I'm Grace Randolph, and we just did some movie math. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll go beyond the trailer for these other top movies.